Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews number 15 with Justin Clark. How's it going?
It's going great. How are you, Cory?
I'm good. We just ended a very long discussion and rant about what's going wrong with our society.
Yeah, and how much I hate dealing with the U.S. healthcare system. It sucks. It's not fun. And like I told Cory in the pregame, I said, "Look, man, like." The U.S. healthcare system is what made me a communist. It truly did. And I dealing with it and it's sort of labyrinthine rules and regulations and paperwork. And, you know, one of the things that people who believe in free market capitalism always tell you is that, oh, well, if you unleash the market forces will make things less bureaucratic and there'll be less red tape and all that kind of shit.
And it's just not true.
And that's absolutely not true. That's just absolutely not true at all. Like, we live in an extremely bureaucratic society. If arguably it's more bureaucratic. Which is why, like, I keep saying to people, you can't simply reform this shit. You can't. Yeah. You have to upend it. You have to upend the system and replace it with something else. And that is my segue into talking about the two books we're talking about tonight. So tonight is a sort of dual review. I read these books. Both are on the same time. They're both on the same subject, which is the Russian Revolution. So we've been building up to talking about the Russian Revolution. So 2 episodes ago, we talked about Marx and Engels. We talked about the Communist Manifesto, where they talked about the importance of revolution. And then we read State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. Yep. And this discussion will be talking about 2 books. The first one we'll be talking about is October, The Story of the Russian Revolution by Chinamiaville, which was published by Verso Books in 2017. And another book called Lenin on the Train by Catherine Merridale, which was also published in 2017 for the centenary of the Russian Revolution, which happened in 1917. So, the Russian Revolution. Holy shit, where to begin? So, it's important to understand that, let's start from Marx. Sure. So, let's start with Marx and his analysis of capitalism and his analysis of revolution. Okay. Marx's original idea of the countries that would go socialist, the ones that would have a successful Russian socialist revolution and become socialist societies, were not places like Russia. They were places like England, Germany, or the United States. And it turns out that it's a lot harder to carry out a socialist revolution in those kinds of societies than in a place like Russia. Mm-hmm. And for a myriad of reasons. One, in places like Germany, the United States, and Britain, the sort of contradictions of capitalism are better hidden. And what I mean by that is that people don't feel the brunt of capitalism nearly as forcefully as they do in sort of societies that have immense amounts of poverty. Now, there's certainly poverty in Germany and England and totally in the United States. I see unhoused people every day I come home from work. Yeah. And it breaks my heart and it makes me sad. It also makes me want to punch the people in power in the face. But it's a mixture of sadness and anger, right? Yeah. But the contradictions are well hidden in a way that makes people, class consciousness is not really there in the way that it might be. You have to develop these things, right? Yeah. Now, why was Russia kind of this place that this could happen in? Well, it's not to say that it couldn't have happened in the United States or Britain or Germany, but it happened in Russia, I think, for a myriad of reasons, many of which both of these books go into. Okay. The first thing we'll talk about is just the society itself, the economic organization of the society, which is that in 1917, when the Russian Revolution happened, Russia was essentially a proto-capitalist feudal state. So it is proto-capitalist or pre-capitalist in the sense that it has many of the hallmarks of capital, wherein it has, banking, it had commerce, trade, exports, imports, so on. So it did have some rudimentary elements of capitalism within it. But the social system was still largely feudal. So, a lot of times when you learn Russian history, there are kind of two events that a lot of people think of as being the two sort of trigger events of maybe what would happen in 1917. The first one actually goes all the way back to 1861, which is the abolition of serfdom in Russia. So this happens under the Romanov dynasty. The Romanov dynasty by 1917 had been in power for almost 300 years.
Okay.
And I think I think the Tsar at the time in 1861, I think maybe it'd been Alexander II, but I could be wrong. I probably am. One of the things you're going to learn tonight is that there are a lot of fucking names and there are a lot of fucking dates, and I don't always remember all of them. My job is to be the big picture guy that gives you the why about all of this. Because,
That's
you can go out and you can read all the little names and dates. It's actually a criticism I have of this book, is that this book is quite good, but it has the sort of name date problem where it breaks things down into little minute details, and it often loses sight of the why question. This book does a little bit of a better job with it, although the interpretations are not always great. Okay. And we'll get into what my criticisms of these two books are. They're both pretty decent. I don't think they're horrible. I think some of the conclusions they make are bad. And some of them are what the kids today might call cringe. But I will say that, overall, it's some decent stuff. So let's go back to what I was saying. So 1861 is the abolition of serfdom. So Russia had serfdom until 1861. I think it's really important for people to understand that, because serfdom pretty much existed in Europe until like the 1600s, 1700s. Right. So it existed in Russia for like 150 to 200 years longer than it did everywhere else.
Right.
Russia was kind of this backwater of Europe and always felt itself as much, especially in the leadership, right? So that's one of the really big main events. The second main event that happens is actually in 1905. And in 1905, there is actually an actual revolution that happens. It started by women. I think it started by female garment workers who revolt in St. Petersburg. And it leads to initially some reforms by the monarchy, particularly the creation of the Duma, which was the legislative body, and which would become a key component of the 1917 revolution. And so with all of that in mind, that's kind of setting the stage. These are all the sort of pre-events that get you to 1917. So what's 1917 like? So in 1917, the world is in World War I. And I will say this a lot, that like World War I is probably the most important event of the 20th century. I mean, it kind of sets up everything that would happen later. Right. Whether it be the Russian Revolution, the decline and fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the dissolution of that into different states that were carved up in the Middle East and the problems we still have today. Obviously the rise of fascism in Italy and in Germany, and the rise of the Third Reich in Germany is especially influenced by World War I. So a lot of historians will argue that the Russian Revolution may never have happened without World War I. I think that's reasonable, in the sense that the Russian people and the Russian state were pretty much at their wits' end by 1917. World War I starts in 1914.
Okay.
And the Russians are on the opposite side. So they're fighting against Germany, and they're fighting against basically Germany, right? And so like Russia is in an alliance with Britain and the United States, much like it would be in World War II. Okay. And Germany, its impact on World War I is sort of incalculable in a lot of ways. For us Marxists, like, we kind of look at World War I as a question of imperialism, which we can talk about when we talk about Lenin's book, Imperialism. A lot of bourgeois historians will say, World War I, how did it happen? We don't know. This was like a bunch of, some guy was shot, some duke was shot, and a bunch of alliances sort of triggered domino effect, and they started fighting each other. No, it's not really about that. The World War I started because the major European powers of the world had colonized basically every corner of the globe, and they had nowhere else to expand their capital. And so then they started to fight themselves.
Right.
And it was a fight for capital accumulation more than anything else. So with that in mind, that's where we are. So we're in 3 years into World War I when the revolution in Russia happens. And for those who don't know, there are actually two in 1917. There's the first one, which happens on February 23rd, 1917, which is when what's called the February Revolution.
Okay.
It happened, ironically enough, on International Women's Day, and a provisional government was set up. And this provisional government was the interim between February and October.
Okay.
So for other additional context, we talk a lot about the backwardness of Russia. We have this sort of semi-feudal state whose economy and society have been ravaged by World War I. That's the context. The other thing that's kind of an interesting point, and something that Catherine Merridale makes abundantly clear in her very clunky use of dates in her book, is that at the time, just to underscore what people would see as the backwardness of Russia, they were on the calendar that every other major power of Europe was. So today we use what is called the Gregorian calendar, and most places use the Gregorian calendar. Before the Gregorian calendar was something called the Julian calendar, and that was what Russia was on. And so the dates of the Russian Revolution are either in February or March or October or November 1917, depending on how you talk about it.
Okay.
So I can't remember how many days it is, but it's like 2 weeks off, or it took a week and a half off is basically the dates.
Okay.
So in February of 1917, the provisional government is established. Within weeks, the soldiers essentially mutiny against the Romanov family. And then the Tsar, I think the Tsar is Nicholas II, abdicated his throne. I want to make sure I have that right. Yeah, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne on March 2nd, 1917. This is a very important event because Russia had been under the Tsars for like 1,000 years.
Right.
Tsar is basically a anglicized Cyrillic version of Caesar, which is like king, right? Yeah, all these go back to Caesar. And what happened was that there were essentially soldiers who said, "We are not fighting the war for you anymore. We're done.
World War I was enough.
World War I. We've had enough. We're done." And so the other important development that happens from 1905 on, and why 1905 is important going forward, is not only do you have the reform of the Duma, but you also have the development of what were called Soviets. And people have heard that word, obviously, because we're going to talk about the Soviet Union. Right. What is a Soviet? A Soviet is a workers' council. And so Soviets were set up across the country, and the one that was very influential and important was the Petrograd Soviet, which Petrograd, which is St. Petersburg. Okay. It was called Petrograd during the Soviet Union, and now it's called St. Petersburg again.
Okay.
So this is to set up all the context for what we're going to talk about later. Now, what I want to talk about is, I guess I'll stop there if you have any questions or anything you'd like to add.
That's the first revolution that we're up to.
Yeah, we're up to the first revolution. So February of 1917, there's a revolution. The Tsar uses violence. It backfires on him. The soldiers turn on him. He abdicates the throne, and a provisional government is set up.
Okay, so that's kind of what I was curious about, is like what comes next is now they've got the Tsar stepped down. So you've got this provisional government. You've
got a provisional government, and it's made up of different factions.
Okay.
So this is where you get into kind of how all these different factions interacted with one another and their influence. So there's really 4 main factions that you have to keep in mind.
Okay.
The first is the cadets. The cadets were basically Democrats.
Okay.
They were liberals. Okay. Then you had the SRs, and the SRs were socialist revolutionaries. They were neither socialist nor revolutionary. That was a failed joke. But anyway, yeah, they called themselves socialist revolutionaries. Basically, They were like DSA reformist types.
Ah, okay.
Then you have the Mensheviks, and the Menshevik stands for minority. And Mensheviks were like slightly to the left of the SRs, but still fairly normie.
Okay.
And then you had the Bolsheviks.
Right.
And the Bolsheviks are described as the majority. Now, why are the Bolsheviks called Bolsheviks and Mensheviks called Mensheviks? Well, they're called that because when there was a meeting of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP, it was made up of two different factions, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and they met to decide on policy. And the reason that the Bolsheviks are called the Bolsheviks is because the majority of the RSDLP supported the policies of the Bolsheviks, and a minority of the RSDLP supported the policies of the Mensheviks. So that's how they got their names.
Okay.
Bourgeois historians will often not talk about this correctly. They'll say things like, oh, the Bolsheviks were always in the minority and the Mensheviks were always in the majority, and they just sort of switch names to make themselves sound better than they really were. It's not true. Like, it's related to parties.
Okay.
It's related to parties and people within the party. It's not related to the public, right? Now, over time, the public will support the Bolsheviks more, especially within the Soviets, over time. So this gets us to a sort of overview of the first book, October. So Chinamieville is a science fiction writer, and he's also a radical socialist. Okay. But he is of the Trotskyist tendency.
Okay.
So he is a follower of Leon Trotsky, who was the head of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War, a key leader of the Russian Revolution, and later exiled and defector of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period. With that in mind, basically, this book is like a Reader's Digest version of Leon Trotsky's book, The History of the Russian Revolution, which I have behind me. It's enormous. I have not read it. I have it, but it's huge, and it's a book that's not just history, but it's also theory. So he gets into like a lot of what we've talked about tonight, like the economic context and the political context. So that's that book. Lenin on the Train, Merridale, this is bourgeois history at its finest, or infamous, however you want to say it. So, both books come from a perspective that I do not share. I am not a Trotskyist, nor am I a bourgeois liberal. But she actually has a much more sympathetic view of Lenin than Merridale. Merridale actually has a more sympathetic view of Lenin than Mieville does.
Okay.
I just realized how close their last names are. But long story short, the narrative that Mieville kind of spins is that the Russian Revolution was this wonderful event in human history that could have really led to something wonderful, and instead it led to brutality and Stalinism and everything going to shit. It's all awful. Okay. Merridale kind of does the same thing. They both kind of have this narrative of everything was really great until like about 1918, when you start getting into the Civil War, and that's when the sort of the emerging Soviet government of Bolshevik government of Lenin started to implement war communism and more measures to fight back against reactionaries and people trying to undermine the revolution.
Okay.
And so that's both books have Lenin as a central figure. He is the central figure of both books. He is the central figure of the Russian Revolution period. Right. And so who was Lenin? Well, we talked a little bit about that last time. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, he was born in 1870 and came from a relatively prosperous background. His brother dies when he's fairly young. His brother was a political activist in his own right and was sort of killed for his activities. And so a lot of bourgeois historians will say that, Lenin did all that he did to avenge his brother, and like this kind of like, pseudo like psychoanalytic babble that's like nonsense. Like, the one thing that I think Merridale gets right in her book, Lenin on the Train, is how deeply committed Lenin was to his ideas. The way that people often write about Lenin is that, he was this ruthless, evil man who used the sort of oratory or used the sort of language of Marxism to achieve his own selfish ends.
Right, because he wanted power and he wanted to be, I've heard, everybody's heard that.
And that's horseshit. I mean, that's truly horseshit. I mean, Lenin was dedicated to the socialist revolution. He was dedicated to advocating and fighting for a world for working people. Okay. And so I think it's nonsense to think that it's all like this sort of like I said, sort of psychoanalytic shit that I'm not as terribly, because the problem I have with that kind of reading of history sometimes is it's like you're trying to like read the thoughts of someone who's dead.
Yeah, that's right.
You're trying to get into the head of somebody instead of looking at what the evidence tells you. Yeah. And what the evidence tells you, if you read Lenin and you actually read his works, he's actually dedicated to this shit.
It's much more speculative to try and read his mind after the fact.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and they'll always say, like, well, you have to read between the lines, but don't do that to, like, bourgeois politicians, but do it to these guys. And it's like, I get it. Like, I understand that there's some point to that, but whatever. Yeah. So that's where I think the books, but I think Merridale does a really great job of explaining that Lenin was a true believer. He genuinely believed in this and genuinely cared about the cause for revolution and fought for it dearly. Often, sometimes to the detriment of himself in terms of his own physical health and his mental health and his well-being, but also to the detriment of the cause itself, because he would often butt heads with people. And especially people who were more moderates within the factions of the party. I mean, Trotsky was one of those. Trotsky was started as a Menshevik and was sort of more of a, center within, this schema, right? And became a Bolshevik more over time. Lenin had always been, Bolshevik. So essentially what Lenin argued for, and I think that Mieville calls it in his book, revolutionary defeatism. Now, what that means is not what you'd think. It's not like he's like, I'm a revolutionary, but I'm not doing anything. It's not what it means. What revolutionary defeatism means is I believe that in order to carry out a successful revolution, one of the hallmarks of carrying out that successful revolution is to promise the people that we will end the war, that we will end our involvement in the war. Not end the war, but ending Russian involvement in the war, which the Bolsheviks do. Okay. When they get in power, they do end their involvement in World War I with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. So pretty soon after they gain power, within a year, they're out of the war. And so, it's because World War I goes on until about 1919. But they get out of the war. And so there were people within the socialist movement who were debating about whether or not Russia should end its involvement in World War I. The main person who was on the side of, yes, let's end our involvement in World War I was Lenin. On the other side of that debate was the person who was basically the head of the Provisional Government that had taken over since February 1917, as a guy named Alexander Korensky. Okay. Alexander Korensky was a socialist. Some would say, I guess you could call him like a democratic socialist or like sort of moderate socialist leader. Okay. I think he might have been a socialist revolutionary and or a Menshevik, and he comes to power and he's the leader of this sort of provisional government. Everybody sees him as this great hope. Okay. And in fact, even the United States did. So the first state to recognize the provisional government in 1917 was the United States.
That's interesting.
Partially because they liked the idea of a more democratic Russia that would be involved in the war, because Russia were allies with the United States. And their whole thought was, great, the United States were like, this is fantastic. You're going to stay in the war and you're going to move to democratic governance and essentially capitalism, like liberal capitalism. Fuck yeah, we're all on board. We'll support the shit out of this.
Right. They didn't expect what they were actually happening.
The problem that the provisional government had were the constant debates about how to wield power. And when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, there was a power vacuum that was left. There was no natural leader to replace him. And Korensky, for all intents and purposes, was not the guy. For a lot of people, he seemed like the guy who could be it, but he wasn't.
Okay.
And so what happens later on is Korensky and the provisional government support continuing the war. And they support staying in the war. And this leads to what's called the June Offensive, which is carried out in June 1917. The June Offensive fails.
Okay.
Fails miserably. And it really gets people to understand the gravity of staying in the war and how impactful it is on the Russian people, particularly in regards to fuel and food and a general sense of exhaustion. That's the other thing too. There's a sort of exhaustion that people feel of being involved in the war. Okay. And this really highlights the problems within the provisional government itself, that there are tensions that exist within all of this. While all of this is going on, the Bolsheviks are kind of figuring out, okay, we don't want anything to really do with this provisional government. It's trash.
It's not working.
And it's not working. And Lenin rightly argues in what would later be called the Lenin theses, the Lenin theses, the April theses of April 1917,
okay,
which are a big component of this book, because this book is kind of a little microcosm of the Russian Revolution. The Mieville book is like the whole thing. This is basically like a couple months. And it's Lenin's legendary train ride in April 1917, where he returns from exile in Zurich, Switzerland, to come back to Russia, a place he had not really called home in 20 years.
Okay.
So Lenin had been largely exiled and kicked out of the country for many, many years for his political activities. He was one of the key founders of the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which would later become the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the CPSU. And he was, through that whole time, articulating the importance of revolution. And so the April theses are all about how we should not involve ourselves with the provisional government. We should fight for revolution and support the will of the Soviets.
Okay.
And one of the slogans at the time was all power to the Soviets, which is like all power to the workers' councils.
Right.
Screw this provisional government, give the power to Soviets, give the power to the people. And the April theses were so radical to even some of the Bolsheviks that there were some of them who were like, is Lenin fucking crazy? Like, does he really think we can do this? And then they are convinced by him. When he returns, they call it, Edmund Wilson has a very famous book called To the Finland Station. I actually have it behind me. It's also about the Russian Revolution, but it's more like an intellectual history of the Russian Revolution. And what the Finland Station is it's the station that Lenin returns to when he comes in to Petrograd, when he comes into St. Petersburg.
Okay.
Because the train route that he takes goes from Zurich, Switzerland, through Germany, up through Sweden, through Finland, into St. Petersburg.
Okay.
And so the Finland Station is a very famous phrase within the history of the Russian Revolution. He would also leave and come back at other times. The Russian trade ride in April 1917 is very important because it's the first time he's really returned to Russia in decades. But then during the Russian Revolution itself, he kind of leaves and goes to Finland for a few months and then comes back. I mean, we talked about that when we talked about State and Revolution, that he wrote most of that actually while in another country. He wasn't in Russia when he wrote it. And then there's and then he comes back. And the second time he comes back in disguise, where he's shaved off his beard, and he's got a bad wig on. And they help him get a bad wig, and a hat and all this jazz. So
because he's coming back, is that because he's coming back to overthrow the provisional government?
Yeah. So he's coming back to, and so they're like, let's put him in disguise so that it doesn't look like him. That it doesn't. I can't remember if there's a picture of him in this or not. Let me see if I can find. I don't know if Catherine Merridale includes a picture of him in the. I don't know if they do or not. While we're talking, this is Alexander Korensky.
Okay.
This kind of nebbishy, flat-topped looking fella.
Right.
I don't think there is a picture of him in the wig. It's awesome. You know what? I think I have it on another. You know what? I have it on another book. Give me a second. Yeah. There's a book I have about Lenin called Lenin Reloaded, and this is the picture of him in the wig.
Okay, with his beard cut off.
I think he kind of looks like, I could be wrong, but this is just subjective, but I think he kind of looks like Antonio Banderas. But
yeah, I guess I could see the resemblance.
But yeah, so that picture of him is in 1917 when he's coming in one time. Now, the train ride itself is very interesting because the train ride was essentially assisted by the German government. The German government took a bet on Lenin, and they won, but they also kind of lost.
Okay.
So they won in the short term, and they lost big time in the fucking long term. So, and in the short term, their idea was, well, if we can get, because of his idea that Russia should end its involvement in the war, that if we can help him get home, and we can help him foment revolution, then Russia will get out of the war, and that's one of our enemies taken out like that. We don't even have to fight him. All we have to fight is the British, the Americans. Game over. Now, this has led to people who believe and have argued over the years that the German government actually financed Lenin's revolutionary activities. And Merridale actually devotes an entire chapter of her book to that. Okay. And what she comes to, and I appreciate her fucking honesty, is that there's no real evidence to suggest that. Okay. Except for innuendo. The only evidence that we have from the period is that the only thing the Germans really did is they just let him leave. Okay. But they didn't really give him any money. But they let him leave. And you could argue that letting him leave is about as bad as giving him money. And that's what Churchill said. You know, Churchill had Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, vehement racist, war criminal maniac, who said that, introducing Lenin into the Russian body politics was like a Bacchus Sibyllae or something like that. He described it as a disease that would spread. And I guess to his perspective, that's true. But anyway, so in the short term, the Germans thought, well, okay, well, this will help us because they'll get out of the war and that'll help. In the long term, it was really not good for them. Mainly just because then the October Revolution happened. But the book both books are kind of like day by day chronicles of what's going on. Okay. And so I don't remember every single detail of each one of these books.
It would be pretty hard to remember every detail.
And either one of, and it's not really the point. These are books you can kind of go back to for specific details. Right. I mean, there are all kinds of like fun little tidbits about how like Lenin helped organize lines for the bathroom queue in the train car they were in. That they didn't want something fancy, so they had a third class car with wooden seats. You know, that it was a pretty austere arrangement. They didn't want to look like they were, being garish as they were trying to carry out a revolution, which is good on them. Yep. And so, yeah, so the Merridale book was a lot more fun to read just because it's a lot more readable in some respects, except for how she does the dates, where she'll put like the Julian calendar date and the Gregorian calendar date right next to each other. And so you're constantly reading the 25th of April or the 3rd of May. So, and it's like, that's a little annoying. Which date am I on? Mieville does the right thing, which is that he says, I'm just going to use the Julian calendar throughout the book because that was what they were experiencing at the time. And if you actually use the Gregorian calendar, it's no longer October, it's November. So there's that. So months go by, And another major event happens, and it happens in August. And August is one of the major events of the Russian Revolution, the sort of interregnum between the February Revolution and October, is what's described as the Kornulov Affair. And the Kornulov Affair involved a man named General Levir Kornulov, who was this ultra arch-conservative member of the Provisional Government. He basically thought that Alexander Kerensky was a wuss who couldn't lead the people, and he said, I think I can do it better than him. And so he tried to do a military coup. And the military coup failed, but it left the Provisional Government extremely wounded because people didn't believe in the authority of the Provisional Government. No one did. Most people believed in the authority of the Soviets, but most of the public and the peasants certainly didn't either. But the only people who really supported the Provisional Government were the Provisional Government themselves and some Western allies like the United States. So, with that in mind, the Kornulov Affair blows up in Kornulov's face, and the Kerensky sort of lives to die another day, and ultimately it just continues to weaken and weaken and weaken the Provisional Government.
Okay.
And the Bolsheviks take advantage of these problems, these sort of issues regarding the Provisional Government. And they argue for a couple of things. Obviously, they argue for a revolt of the peasants and the workers.
Right.
So in Russia, most of the people who lived in Russia were not proletarians. They weren't, because they weren't people who worked for a wage. Most people in Russia were peasants. They were people who lived on the land and farmed.
Yeah.
So Lenin, in his, I think, brilliant foresight, understood this. And this is where you get one of the earlier sort of revisions of Marxism, where instead of it just being proletarians, it's a uniting of the proletarians and the peasants. And so if you can get the proletarians and the peasants on your side, it's to your benefit. And that's what the Bolsheviks do over months, is they convince the Soviets that they are in their favor. And as time goes on, it continues until finally we get to October. And what happens is relatively bloodless. Most people think of the Russian Revolution as being this like super bloody affair, and it becomes that with the Russian Civil War. Right. But the day of the October of the Bolshevik Revolution, it's not that violent. And the day itself, what happens is that on October 24th, 1917, the Bolsheviks start to wage a campaign against the Provisional Government. The Provisional Government fights back. And this is all going on in St. Petersburg, or Petrograd. The Provisional Government loses.
Well, sorry, I apologize. We have our single viewer had a comment/question.
Yeah.
And some random geek said, wait, there is a difference between the proletarians and the peasants. I imagine they're the same.
They are in spirit, but they're different in terms of their relationship to the economic mode of production. So proletarians are those who work for a wage. Okay. So they are in a factory or they work in a shop and they work for a wage. Peasants are people who work on the land. They're dedicated to the land and they sell the proceeds of the land for their subsistence. Yeah. So they earn a wage in that sense, but it's not the same thing because proletarians are going to be largely urban and peasants are going to be largely rural, and they have different value sets and they have kind of different goals for what they want.
Okay.
But in general, the Bolsheviks promised them, Bolsheviks basically promised them that they would achieve what they wanted. And it was summed up in a phrase that the Bolsheviks made famous, which was peace, land, and bread. Mm. Peace represented getting out of the war and the revolutionary defeatism of Lenin. Land represented giving the land to the peasants.
Okay.
And so the peasants would have control over their land and they would have control over their livelihoods. Okay. And then bread was food. There was a huge amount of food insecurity within Russia during the revolution, especially by the time you get to October.
Right.
So you do have people starving. So I hope that explains it. They are the same in spirit and they're the same in purpose, but there's just a slight distinction between the way that they interact with the system itself. That's all. I hope that answers your question. And so they fight, and then finally, on October 25th, 1917, at 10 a.m., the Bolsheviks declared that they won. And they did. And they stormed the Winter Palace, and they seized control of power from the Provisional Government. And they say the rest is history. So we have a period of extreme chaos, disintegration, political maneuvering, failed coups, revolts, all kinds of stuff. And it leads to the Provisional Government falling apart and the Bolsheviks taking power. Okay. And so one of the first things that they do right out the gate is what I mentioned earlier, which is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which withdrew Russia from the First World War. And that happened on March 3rd, 1918. And so basically within 6 months, they were out of the war. And then within the same time frame is when the Russian Civil War begins. And the Civil War is between the Red Army and the White Army. The Red Army represents the Bolsheviks, who had taken power in 1917 in October, and the White Army represented, the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, those who had failed to go along with the revolution, and those who outwardly fought it, including the United States. One thing that people don't realize is that during the entire history of the Cold War, a lot of people think that the Cold War starts in 1945. The Cold War really began as soon as the revolution happened. I mean,
wasn't the Red Scare, it sort of started in 1920, didn't it? Ish?
Yeah. So you have the first Red Scare that happens in the United States, and it starts in 1917, 1918. And this is when Debs is thrown in, Eugene V. Debs, the later Lieber, who's thrown in prison for speaking out against World War I under the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were used to go after communists and anarchists. Emma Goldman was sort of exiled from the country because of this too, the anarchist leader from America. And so, so the Cold War really does begin as soon as the Soviet government exists. And it's fought bitterly for 4 years. And then at the end of the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union is established, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. And then we go into the Stalin period, where Lenin dies in 1924 after a series of strokes that had been exacerbated by, I think, 1, if not 2, assassination attempts.
Jeez.
Where someone almost took off his head. And then in 1928, Stalin solidifies his power and rules the country for the next, 30 years.
Right.
And so the way that both books tend to write it, and what is interesting is the painting on the cover of Merridale's book is very instructive for talking about her interpretation of the revolution. So this is a painting that I'm trying to remember the actual details because they're in the book here. So this is a painting from M.G. Sokolov, and it's a picture of Lenin coming back to the Finland station in the spring of 1917. And he's there, he's holding his hat. The people are all happy to see him. However, there's a character right behind him who kind of looks like Super Mario, and that's Stalin. Now, Stalin was not on the train. That is a little bit of historical myth-making on the part of whoever painted that, Sokolov. Merridale's little caption in the book is about that painting is... with no regard for history, but a keen sense of self-preservation, the artist added Stalin to the scene. So,
so he felt it was necessary.
So, both of these books fall into what Grover Furr calls the Anti-Stalin Paradigm. Now, again, I'm about to preface everything I say with I am not a Stalinist. I just care about the truth. And I care about not distorting history in the sense of some fucked up agenda you have. But what I will say is this, that basically once you get past the revolution, both of these authors talk about how everything is horrible and sucks.
Okay.
When we know that's really not true. Like, there were things that were bad, and there's no doubt, right? But you also saw, the life expectancy of most Soviet citizens dramatically increase. Not to mention the fact that you have two constitutions, one in 1918 and one in 1936, that greatly expanded democratic rights for most people within the Soviet Union, including early on, the decriminalization of abortion and the decriminalization of homosexuality, which happened almost immediately when the Bolsheviks come to power, which is something they don't tell you about in school. And then in the 1936 Constitution, there was guaranteed rights for those with different dialects. So if you lived in a small town and you were the only kid who spoke a certain language, the Soviet government was obligated under the Constitution to teach you in your native language. So and they did it. So there are some good things, right? And I think the biggest problem I have with the way that people often write about the Soviet Union is that they talk about how, everything was kind of great. There was this revolutionary moment and things could be wonderful. And then everything's fucking horrible after that. It's like, no, that's not true, right? I mean, that's kind of like if people said, the American Revolution was so wonderful, 1776, and then everything after that was shit, which people could argue that, fine. I think
reality has more nuance to it than that.
Exactly, right? Like, yes, the Constitution was written by slave owners, but you have the First Amendment, which guarantees freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, which, in my opinion, is one of the hallmarks of any civilized society, is having the freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of conscience. So, like, those are super important. Like, those are good values to have.
We have... I kind of been letting you go here, but we have a couple questions.
Go for it.
From some random geek. And let's see.
I didn't know if that was his name or not, or if you were insulting him.
No, that's his
that's
username.
His name? Okay.
Or their username. Sorry. Where are we? Okay. The first one. Was this the revolution where there were riots at the breadlines? I think we're referring to the October Revolution.
Yes. So early on there were issues with the food. And part of that is, some of that also happens like earlier in the summer too. And Merridale writes about that in her book as well, that there are legitimate issues with people being able to gain food and there being riots as a result. That's true. Like, that's absolutely true. But in terms of the Bolsheviks gaining power in Petrograd on October 25th, it was a largely pretty quiet affair. But yes, those things did happen for sure. And they were precipitated by the fact that the provisional government could not really meet the needs of its people. That's part of the reason why the Bolsheviks took power in the first place.
Right.
It's the whole peace, land, and bread thing. But yes, that stuff did happen for sure. But, and there were famines in the Soviet Union well into the 1930s.
Right.
But after the 1930s, there were no more famines in the Soviet Union. They didn't happen anymore. And same thing with China. They had, some major famines in the 50s, and then they never had famines after that, And part of it is they're victims of geography. Part of it is victims of bad planning, for sure. But yeah. So yes, those things certainly without a doubt happened. But they didn't happen because of like the Bolsheviks taking power. Right. They happened as a result of the provisional government breaking down.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. Then see, didn't Lenin dissolve one of the Constitution assemblies when they didn't vote the way he wanted them to? I'm not sure what this is referring to, so I don't have the background on this.
So that's later on, and part of that is, again, it's
after the revolution.
Yeah. So I think this is referring to the installation of war communism. So during the Russian Civil War, some of the sort of constitutional provisions were pulled back in the defense of the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. But that's a little more outside of the scope of the books that we discussed tonight. But so I can't give you as clear an answer on that as I'd like to. But yeah, that is something that definitely happened as a result of the Civil War.
And they also mentioned that FDR did the New Deal in order to avoid the 1917 revolution in the U.S.
Yep.
And also, any society is 3 days of missed meals away from a revolution.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And that's why their siren song was Peace Land, Peace Land and Bread. But you're right about the New Deal for sure. So like why the New Deal ended up being what it was in the scope that it was largely was because of the U.S. Communist Party. So at the time, the U.S. Communist Party was led by a few different leaders. One of them was a guy named Earl Browder, who would run for president on the Communist Party ticket in 1936. Another guy is named John W. Ford, who was an African-American, and he's the first African-American to be a vice presidential nominee on a party ticket. I think, well, it's not true. I think Frederick Douglass was as well. I think he was on like the one that came out of Seneca Falls in the 1870s. But at the time, John W. Ford was one of the first African-American candidates on a major party ballot. And at the time, the Communist Party was. Another guy who was a key leader of the Communist Party in the 1930s was a guy named William Z. Foster. So all these guys were very important. At the same time, you had the U.S. Socialist Party, which was led by a guy named Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas was sort of the heir apparent to not Franklin Roosevelt, but sort of the heir apparent to Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs, who had been the leader of the U.S. Socialist Party for decades, who had run on the Socialist Party ticket multiple times. I think that FDR was a very astute politician. I think he understood that if capitalism could not be saved from itself, that it could not be saved at all. And so the New Deal should be seen as that. It should be seen as capitalism saving itself. Yeah. And liberal democracy saving capitalism from itself, rather than seeing it as this like socialist experiment. It's not really socialism. It was Keynesianism. Right. It was the ideas of John Maynard Keynes, the British economist, and the idea of priming the pump by having the government spend in times of economic turmoil as to increase demand for services and get the economy going. You're absolutely right about Franklin Roosevelt. And you're absolutely right about, to go back earlier, because I apologize for not giving you as good an answer as I'd like to, about Lenin and the Provisional Government, not Lenin and the Constitutional Assemblies. There's a book by, I think his name is Bruce Lincoln, and it's a book on the Russian Civil War. I think it's called Red Victory. Okay. And I think that book goes into more detail about those specific things if you're interested in learning more about them. Also, cool. Trotsky's book on the Russian Revolution goes through all this too, because his book doesn't just go through 1917, it goes through all the Civil War too. And
they mentioned that they read that something like that from Rudolf Rocker's essay, Marx and Anarchism.
Oh, okay, cool. So, I've never read Rudolf Rocker. That's interesting. I'll have to check that out. Neat. And so, and the thing is that like there were certainly ways in which the Soviet system was not as democratic as you would like it to be. I mean, part of the issue the Soviet Union had was that at the beginning there was a truly genuine effort for it to be bottom up. There really was. And over time, those problems became exacerbated just by the nature of the system itself in its relationship to global capitalism. This is what Michael Perini writes about when he talks about the idea of siege socialism, right? That people always talk about, these states become so, authoritarian or whatever. Well, there's a reason for that, which is that in order to save any semblance of a socialist revolution, you have to build a systems of authority to be able to keep the capitalists out. You cannot expect them to just be cool with you going socialist. So that's kind of the problem. And again, there are certainly critiques of that system, without a doubt. But, my own political orientation as a Marxist-Leninist is that while I certainly acknowledge the contradictions within the Soviet system and the problems associated with it, I largely champion a lot of what the Soviet Union did, because it did bring a lot of people out of poverty. It did bring a lot of people out of human misery. And it really did advance an international proletariat in ways that the United States certainly didn't, especially in regards to decolonial struggles in the 1960s and 70s, which the Soviet Union was a big part about, especially in Africa. Yeah. I mean, and there's a book about this too, if you're interested. So there's a book called The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World by Walter Rodney.
Okay.
Walter Rodney was a Pan-African socialist. That might be a fun book to do at some time too, because you get a perspective of somebody who is a Pan-African socialist writing in the 1960s and 70s about the Russian Revolution and its impact on decolonial struggles. So that would be a cool one to check out as well.
Cool.
Yeah. So that's it. That's pretty much the broad strokes of it. There's so much more I could talk about. There's so much more details we can go into. I want to thank the person for the good questions. I appreciate that. Thank you. And I apologize if I didn't answer them as thoroughly as you'd like. But, you know, part of that is it's always a process, you know. This is the kind of stuff they don't always teach you in school. And I myself, I mean, I took a course on the Soviet Union in my undergrad. So, you know, a lot of this I learned then, but, you know, some stuff, you know, they don't really teach you, especially in regards to the way in which the United States tried their absolute damnedest to end the Soviet system right even before it began. So that's the Russian Revolution. And in my opinion, it's one of the great events of the 20th century. It's one of the most important events of the 20th century. And for working people, you know, regardless of however you feel about what came after, you know, for people who are working people or progressives or socialists of any kind of stripe, you should see the Russian Revolution as a moment in time that we as socialists should be proud of, because it's a moment where the workers really did rise up against a brutal system and tried to replace it with something better.
Yeah. No, that sounds good. So I think you might have mentioned it earlier, but what are we covering next time?
Next time, we will be taking a break from some big history theory stuff.
Okay.
And next time, we'll be talking about the book Stolen by Grace Blakely. How financialization, how to save the world from financialization. This book is a wonderful sort of spiritual sequel to the book we discussed about neoliberalism with David Harvey. Right. This book kind of picks up where that book left off. Cool. And it's great. And we're going to get back into talking about how horrid modern capitalism is and why.
Sounds good. All right. So where can people find you?
You can find me at justinclark.org. That's where I have all my content. I have a new article out about Eugene V. Debs and Robert Ingersoll. Robert Ingersoll is over here. He's my thesis subject. He was a free thinker in the 19th century, and he had a very fun and very rewarding friendship with Eugene V. Debs. They were, you know, my article is the radical friendship because they were both radicals in their own way.
Very cool.
And so there's that. And then the Red Reviews podcast is on my website. So you can go to the podcast tab. All the episodes will be there, and you can see these videos in stunning HD. And you can also listen to the podcast link that I also provide in the show notes. And as I will always do for you, I highly encourage people to sign up for the Patreon. And because Cory does a really great job, and he works really hard to make this a really top-notch production. All I really have to do is read some shit and come on here and talk for an hour. Everything else he does. And so it's really important that folks support his work and all the great stuff he's doing. So, you know, Mind of a Skeptical Leftist on Patreon, right?
Yeah. Or I think it's patreon.com/skepticalleftist.
There you go. So yeah, definitely become a patron.
And actually, Some Random Geek is a patron of the show. So,
well, thank you for being a patron, sir. Cheers.
Non-binary individual.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my bad. See, this is the problem with being a Midwestern shithead. I make these mistakes, so I apologize thoroughly. Cheers to you, comrade. That's why I like comrade.
There we go.
Comrade is
comrade.
Gender neutral. So sorry, I'm genuinely sorry about that. But anyway, so you can check my stuff out there. You can follow me on Instagram at JustinClarkPH. And I post book reviews there. And then I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and here in Indianapolis. And if you want to learn more about the party, you can check it out at pslweb.org.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Justin, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
All right, that's all, folks. Thanks for watching and or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends and on the social media site that you use the most. I want to say thank you again to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated, and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects when I'm not at work, so that I don't have to work as many gig hours. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on your podcast app of choice or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then you can check out the show notes or check my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other shows, which include Skeptarchy, which is a panel show I do with some very smart people, From Many People's Strength, which is a show about Saskatchewan politics, and a new project I'm involved in that's called the Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries with my friend Damien Marie at Hope. My Twitter is @SkepticalLefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. Or you can send me a friend request, which is facebook.com/CJBrainstorm. I accept most friend requests. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which you can find on my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's just all try to be kind to other leftists and to all people, and even if we think they're wrong. The battle that we are fighting is an uphill one and has many obstacles, and we will need all the comrades we can get.